Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Silent Generation. Today happens to be Christmas, and we're going to be talking about new religious movements.
Mm-hmm. It's also going to be the first night of Hanukkah tonight.
Really?
Yeah. It's a nice lining up. Sometimes, like, weird stuff can happen with the lunar calendar where you end up with, like, what was it, Thanksgiving, where you have the two overlapped. But this is exactly when I like Hanukkah, kind of landing on Christmas.
Yeah. So you're going to get presents the next 12, 13 days? What is it?
8.
Okay, sorry.
Damn, you're really showing you're not. If I was, we were just talking about your high school, but I was gonna say, like, damn, you're showing that you went to a bad school if you don't know how many days of Hanukkah there are. No, we went to a great school. No, it's 8 nights. Yeah, and so I have my menorah, my candles, everything's all ready. Yeah.
Yeah.
But today we're going to be talking about new religious movements, not the old ones.
Yeah, but it will be an opportunity too to share some of our general ideas on religion. But what is a new religious movement? So they're basically any religion that started after 1830, because that was when Mormonism was started by Joseph Smith. And if a new religious movement is pretty close to an existing religion, like say a branch of Christianity or Judaism, and it doesn't stray too far from the norms, then it's sort of not viewed as one.
It's like a sect. People just say,
it's just a sect.
It's just a sect. It's like
just
within the mainstream.
Yeah. And these are sometimes called cults, but that's a pejorative term.
Yeah.
I think it says more about like how people outside of the new religious movement view the group than it does about the NRM itself. We'll start saying NRM more and more just because it's a mouthful.
Yeah, we'll say, I think kind of as we wrote the docket, I was realizing we were using NRMs for like, just to kind of stay academic about it. But if you're talking about Jonestown, you can call it a cult. Like, no one's going to be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, let's not just throw that word around. But like, if it ends in a mass suicide, like, we can kind of dispense with the niceties around calling stuff NRMs. But I do wonder, like, what actual people who are actively in NRMs would think about that label, because I know they would hate the term cult. Of course, like, I mean, any well-run NRM has a lot of like kind of dialogue they'll give members to dispel those kind of notions. But I wonder what they would think about new religious movement and just being grouped like that. Because I think a big part of these NRMs is that it's very unique. Like, they have a unique view of the world, and it's separate from what was before. What was before was not working for people. It was not delivering for their lives what they thought they should have. And so I don't think that they want to think about other groups promising the exact same thing or a similar salvation.
Yeah, I think they'd like to just be called religions with no modifier. Like when I was watching Wild Wild Country this week, Sheila, she was in an interview where they were like, oh, you're the leader of a blank. And then the interviewer let her say what she wanted, and she just said religion. She didn't say new religious movement, cult, sect, whatever. She just wanted it to be viewed legitimately as a religion.
Some of them will even balk at religion for a bit, but then I think they eventually like acquiesce at the end. They're like, yeah, no, if we have, texts, believers, positions of power, we're a religion.
Yeah. And it's interesting to note that even if you're using the term new religious movement in place of cult, there's still this like element of persecution, or it still being
charged.
Charged in a way. Like a researcher of new religion studies, J. Gordon Melton, he defines NRMs as those religious groups that have been found from the perspective of the dominant religious community, and in the West that is almost always a form of Christianity, to not be just different, but unacceptably different. So, while people might avoid using the word cult, there still has to be some element of the NRM being treated a bit with disrespect by the rest of society.
Yeah, the fact that if they are being pushed aside and being considered outside the norm, then that's like part of the categorization. If they were like folded into society, we wouldn't really be having this discussion, basically.
So we're going to talk about a lot of different NRMs. I think the first two are the most legitimate. They've been established a lot longer, those being Mormonism and then the Bahá'í Faith.
Yeah, it's like when kind of trying to choose the ones we want to talk about, it's like there's like way too many options. So I think we kept it pretty American, basically, like trying to examine this in a more American context as we usually do. And then, I don't know, I tried to choose ones that were, I guess, dramatic in some way. Like if Mormonism is the oldest, NRM, what are other ones that have been maybe the largest, most powerful in some certain way, or they have something unique, or I also just chose some that have Chicago connections too. But yeah, and then we could do a whole episode on Scientology, and they have very terrifying lawyers. So let's just not touch that at all.
Actually, to start out, though, I asked my dad on the drive home from Christmas Eve at my sister's house last night if he knew anyone who was ever in an NRM or a cult. And he revealed that he had a friend who was involved with Scientology and then actually committed suicide because he got excommunicated by them.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. It's a really sad story. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's called Death of a Scientologist. It was published in the Chicago Reader in 2002. Whoa. But it was someone my dad worked for. And he actually encouraged my dad to do a Scientology course, which my dad did for a month or 6 weeks or something. Wow. But yeah, he had a lot of thoughts.
Yeah, that's the fact that he even did that for a month. That's crazy. There's definitely an alternate reality where maybe your dad got grabbed by that stuff.
I think he was doing it just because he wanted to see the flaws within it, Yeah. I don't think he was approaching it wanting to really convert or anything. But I grew up in a household, which I'll get into later, where mysticism and belief in the other side were very common. Were very normal ideas. So my dad was open to it, but he didn't really he didn't bite the bait.
Yeah.
So the first one we can talk about, though, is Mormonism. This NRM, it was founded by Joseph Smith Jr., who was born in Shannon, Vermont in 1805. And he happened to be born in what is called the Burnt Over District, which we've talked about before on the podcast, because it's sort of in the area where your grandparents live.
I thought it was, but actually this is much more upstate than them. But yeah, this is an area that just had so many revivals. And this is during the Second Great Awakening in America. So there was one religious Christian Great Awakening before the Revolution. There was one right after. And then there was one that started right before the Civil War, got kind of interrupted by the war, and then resumed right after. So that's the Third Great Awakening. And some other NRMs come from that. And then also, Fourth Great Awakening is 1960 to 1980, which is televangelist preachers and stuff.
And that's when a lot of the NRMs we'll talk about later on happened.
Yeah, Jesus people, all those kind of movements.
Yeah. But in the Burnt Over District, Mormonism, spiritualism, Millerism, and the Shakers all emerged from there. I was trying to do some digging to figure out why did this happen in upstate New York when it did? And the period after the American Civil War, religiosity dipped in the United States a bit. It picked up again, I think, in this region, possibly because it was the Church of England was the state religion of that colony. Other colonies had different state religions.
Founded as Puritan colonies,
or Maryland being Catholic, I think. But yeah, this one, there was a power vacuum, I think. And then as people were thinking about how to practice religion, they couldn't go back to the Church of England. They had to get something new. And so that's why I think these NRMs were more seriously considered in upstate New York at the time.
Yeah. And I think that it, it felt like just enough frontier for people. It was still, decently close to the settlements like New York City, but it wasn't as far out as deep into over the Appalachians and entering the Midwest. So it was kind of a safe amount of all right, let's pull people from the city, go out to these settlements here and try and do a tent revival.
Yeah. So with Mormonism, you have a lot more exposure to this because you grew up in the Southwest. But for me, this is my first week ever really learning about it beyond that it was founded by someone who the Catholic Church considers a false prophet, and that they have a third book of the Bible, essentially, with the Book of Mormon. But I learned so many things that were just incredibly bizarre, about his first vision at age 14, where he was visited by God and Jesus, and how he used seer stones, which were used by professional treasure hunters in upstate New York at the time to find treasure. They were a form of scrying, and he used a seer stone to find golden tablets that were written in Egyptian hieroglyphics that he then translated. And if this is all sounding crazy, it kind of is, but
yeah. And you can read about this stuff on the LDS website. And I mean, a lot of Latter-day Saints is when I say LDS. Yeah. In fact, the term Mormon, some Mormons do not really like that, actually. They like to use the official LDS
I didn't
term.
know that. Interesting.
Yeah, The real fundamentalist Mormons love being called Mormons, and they think that the current established LDS
the plural marriage Mormons?
Yeah.
Okay.
Those ones are unapologetically using the term Mormon, I'd say.
Yeah.
And actually, I've found recently stylistically that the LDS Church really emphasizes Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. There's actually over in Logan Square, there's a Mormon temple. I didn't even realize it because I thought it was like, oh, Church of Jesus Christ. Like, who is that? And then you look in the small font below and you're like, oh, it's Mormons. I got it.
Yeah. That's near the Logan Square station, right?
Yeah. It's
yeah,
close
I think
to like
I might
the
have
actual
passed
park.
by it before.
Yeah, it's pretty.
But yeah, all of these elements, though, of Joseph Smith's early life, where he found the Book of Mormon, they kind of remind me of fantasy in a way, like Lord of the Rings and all of those really great books. But it also reminds me of something kind of dumb. So I do physical therapy. I try to do it every night. I don't every night, but I'm doing exercises where I can't watch the TV half the time. So I have to find a show that's a good balance where I kind of like it, but also I don't need to be looking at it. And that for me, the past few months has been the anime Hunter x Hunter.
I'm interesting. That's your choice for like looking away TV, because that means you're watching it dubbed, not subbed.
Yeah.
So it has the English voice.
Well, it's not even that good. Like, I mean, they don't have the budget of like 90s anime shows. It's like, it's not as great, but the intro of the show has the catch line like, "Are you captivated by the magic in the following words? Strange beasts, monsters, vast riches, hidden treasures, evil haunts, uncharted frontiers, the mysterious unknown. Would you like to become a real life hunter?" And that reminds me of Joseph Smith being a treasure hunter.
Yeah. I mean, in all the different ways that the LDS Church has tried to outreach to people, I wouldn't be shocked if there was an anime version of Joseph Smith's life. They produce a lot of movies of varying quality. Okay, they don't vary. They're all bad.
Yeah, they use it as part of their attempts to get converts.
Yeah.
They redo the movie every like decade or so.
Yeah, the story of Joseph Smith. I have a friend in college who got involved with this evangelist Christian group. And one time he was trying to get guys in the fraternity house together. Like, you guys want to go see this movie that my church produced? And I'm like, that's a scary sentence. Like, no church should have a production arm in my mind.
Yeah. And so growing up in the Southwest, like you got to visit Salt Lake City. You also wrote about how you got to visit a temple once.
Yeah. So my exposure to Mormons is even before I lived in Las Vegas. When I was a kid in Phoenix, we had a lot of Mormon friends. And one time we went up to Snowflake, Arizona, which is a place where it actually snows in Arizona, which sounds crazy. But they had just finished building a Mormon temple. And so a temple is restricted in membership just to people who are actually of the Mormon faith and have gone through all the rituals and procedures. Meeting houses, I think, is what they call their regular churches. Like those, I've also been inside those for like my friends' bake sales and stuff, and baptisms. But yeah, so getting to walk around the I guess, what would be the term for it? When you
before you consecrate.
I was going to say desecrate. And I was like, there must be what is happening? Yeah. So we got to go into a Mormon temple before consecration. And I was a very small child, but it was just very white and serene and kind of surreal. And I remember a basin being held up by bulls. And I Googled that, and that is a real thing.
Yeah.
And it varies temple by temple, but a lot of times the bowls are made out of gold, and that just like sets off alarm bells in my Old Testament mind, because like, Moses got the 10 Commandments, went down to the bottom of Mount Sinai, sorry. And then he found that the Jews at the bottom of the mountain had built a golden calf and had started idol worship again, so he broke the tablets. And so just seeing golden calves, I'm like, guys, I don't think we should be doing this. I thought we're all, on a kind of Abrahamic vision here. But yeah, and then so my neighborhood actually in Las Vegas, my little suburban McMansion subdivision, it wasn't McMansions, it was all pretty humble homes, but it was majority Mormon. Basically, we're one of the few non-Mormon families in there. And it felt like there was always the kind of their world, and we weren't really a part of it. They all brought by like nice baked goods and stuff. My dad actually befriended some Mormon missionaries. He had a really bad back surgery, so he couldn't move around much. And the missionaries would come around and he would talk religion with them. Interesting. He always told them he was like never going to convert, but they found him to be a bit of a curiosity and how open he was with dialogue. So they'd help him do like things around the house. He'd get like free labor out of them, and then they'd just talk religion for a bit.
They were like 18-year-old boy missionaries, probably, right?
Mm-hmm, exactly. I've seen them in Chicago on the south side, actually. I gave them some directions.
I've seen them too. I might have mentioned this on the pod, but I used to see two of them at one of my former branches playing Magic the Gathering on computers.
Ooh,
I don't think they're supposed to be doing that because there's demonic imagery and MTG.
Yeah, my Mormon friends in Arizona, the ones we were closest with, I think I've said this on the pod before, but we would always play Harry Potter. We'd go around and like cast spells at each other, and they could only play it with us because all their Mormon friends like were a lot stricter and weren't allowed to play it, so they're always excited.
But yeah, I looked at pictures of the temple of the temple in Snowflake, Arizona, and it has a really beautiful architecture.
Yeah, Mormon architecture is interesting. I mean, the meeting houses are all pretty plain. They just kind of like fit whatever the environment is around there. I would drive past one every day on my way to high school in Las Vegas, and it didn't stand out to me. But they're like big set piece temples. I think there's something a little uncanny about them. I think it's because of the recency of it. Like these are just so clearly not structures from like the 12, 14, 1600s. Yeah. Like these are people who experience like great hardship on their journey west. Basically, after getting kicked out of upstate New York, they were kicked out of Illinois, and they were kicked all the way west, basically, to Salt Lake City. And so there wasn't really like a continuous architectural tradition. Yeah, no. And so walking around, I was on a road trip with friends from Chicago to Las Vegas, actually, in college, and we stopped in Salt Lake City. We stayed at a campground. We did the whole like free tour of the whole like LDS campus, basically, around there. And we were assigned a great tour guide, Sister Hester, who was a Mormon missionary, and she was beautiful. And I remember that very clearly about her. And then because my Mormon friends had said, like in high school, like, oh yeah, the really pretty ones get sent to like Salt Lake City, where they try and like woo guys into the church, basically. And I was like, I felt pretty wooed.
Yeah, because probably that's where it's the most difficult to convert people, because they're so inundated by the church. Mm-hmm. It needs to be something exceptional in order to get them to reconsider it yet again.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And it's interesting, like the whole, so the missionary system is like Mormon boys at the age of 18 go on a mission for 2 years. Girls can choose to. It's much less common. They often go straight into college or straight into marriage sometimes too. But they actually make exceptions with missions. Like I knew some Mormon family where 3 of their kids had cystic fibrosis. And so the oldest one, when he was heading off for his mission, they just sent him somewhere in the US, somewhere very easy, when other people get sent to like Brazil. Like the Brazilian girl that I was going on a few dates with, something came up in the conversation about Mormonism, and I was like basically mansplaining Mormonism to her, and she was just like, I actually grew up Mormon. Like, it turns out her parents were like reached out to by missionaries, like Mormon missionaries in Minas Gerais, Brazil. And yeah, so she was raised in the church up until about the age of like 14 or 15, and she and her parents kind of fell away from it. But that just blew my mind.
Yeah, that's interesting to know. The fastest growing religion in Brazil is actually Pentecostalism, which I think is a newer branch of Christianity than Mormonism. But yeah, that's really taking off there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But yeah, on like the boys having to do 2-year missionary trips, it's like, I feel like that continues to perpetuate the age gap in Mormon relationships. Because, learning about the period of the church under Brigham Young when they had plural marriage, it made me question, like, okay, all these single guys, they probably weren't happy, like, what was going on? And then I learned that part of the reason, or something that probably incentivized all of the very young marriages to Mormon girls, was the fact that there was a shortage. So in order to sort of deal with the deficit, they would marry off girls younger and younger.
Yeah, it's interesting. They say that like polygamy only really emerges in cultures that are like undergoing like material crises in terms of like, like money, resources, that kind of stuff. And also it can often be very unsustainable, polygamy. Like it creates infighting, but I think it can be sustained if you're losing a lot of guys to war, which I believe the Mormons were during their frontier period. So yeah, that's an interesting thing about the Mormons, is that like, at least I see them, it's just like maybe the most well-behaved members of society you'll ever meet, with very like high moral codes. But they were formally at war with the United States government in a series of wars called like the Mormon Wars. There was the Utah War, and things got pretty bloody. At times, the Mormons allied with the Native Americans, which I found very interesting. At one point, they murdered an entire wagon train of 120 people and raised the children as their own. Wow. And yeah, that massacre is actually acknowledged by the church nowadays, and they have like contributed to the monument for that. They're very like understanding. They do qualify it by saying that like, the massacre was not, it could have been encouraged by the kind of rhetoric of Brigham Young, the second leader of the church. It could have been encouraged by his fiery like rhetoric. They insist that he did not direct it. That's the one thing they always hold the line on.
Yeah, the church has been having to recognize a lot of truths in the digital age more so than before because of access to information. Like churches used to deny actually that Joseph Smith had actually had multiple wives. They would just say it wasn't true. But then with the internet, they kind of have to.
Yeah.
But yeah.
And they have a lot to kind of explain, because being such a recent religion, like, they can't just say like, oh, that was hundreds of years ago. They can say like, that was 150 years ago. And Mormonism is kind of a grab bag of stuff that was broadly popular in the 1800s in America. So in the play by the South Park guys, the Book of Mormon, which is very satirical, they say like, and God lives on a planet called Kolob.
Have you seen it? I've never seen it.
I've like seen bits of it. We did like, we have like a Greek week in college where all the Greek organizations compete and we do plays, and we did like basically the Book of Mormon, but restyled for our fraternity.
Yeah.
But yeah, there is like a weird Mormon cosmology that involves planets, because that was something people were thinking about more in the 1800s. Egyptology as well. Like this was not like the King Tut craze of the 1920s. This is before that, but there was large amounts of like Egyptian stuff getting dug up and being sold on the market in the US.
And I think that there were papyri that were used by Joseph Smith. He said that they proclaimed some of his visions or something, but now that, modern Egyptologists can translate it, they're like, that's not what, it doesn't say what he says it said.
It's one of the more embarrassing pieces of, like Mormon lore is like, these were some Egyptian funerary scripts. So just like a very basic thing of like, I think it was like a merchant died or something. So you just take the Egyptian Book of the Dead and you like fill in his name for all these things. But then more like Joseph Smith got his hands on these and he translated them. He said, oh my God, this is the Book of Abraham that we've been looking for this whole time.
Yeah.
And yeah, the church held that line for as long as they could until it became pretty untenable. But they also got caught up in things like phrenology, which is where people would read the bumps in your head and try and determine your character. And that was like kind of a part of the church. It's why they had death masks made of all their like leaders when they passed away. But then they really distanced themselves from that when the rest of America distanced itself from it. So they're the most American religion because they get caught up in everything that America gets caught up in. And they also, the frontier lives so large in their mind as well too. It's like where they were born.
Yeah, and the Book of Mormon actually concludes with Jesus visiting the Americas after his resurrection, which is really wild. But I think that's part of the reason why NRMs get as much traction as they do is because they're able to incorporate things from the modern world that older religions will never be able to. You know, like the Americas, they aren't mentioned at all in the Bible, and they're central to the lives of people living in the United States. So for a religious text to incorporate the United States in the story, it meant a lot to them.
Yeah, it's just always interesting for me because like as Jews, like the stories we tell ourselves is that like, oh, this is us, the people you're reading about in the Torah. It's our people's story. And it's just so interesting that for Christians not being an ethnically locked belief, like there's always going to be that level of detachment. It's amazing that you can sell like this story about Semitic peoples in, 0 AD or 30 AD going through all this. And you can sell that to like Celts in the 800s, Filipino people in the 1880s, like all these different groups. You have to constantly like tell them this story that has nothing to do with their lived experience, but it does in terms of like the life of Christ and all that.
Yeah, it's definitely appealing. And then one more thing about Mormonism that I kind of realized through thinking about it in more recent sects of Christianity, like Pentecostalism, is that once you accept the Messiah or the latest prophet, the next thing that you get really excited about is the end times, because that's the only part of the story that you can realistically sort of envision yourself being a part of. Across all of these NRMs, it kept coming up.
Yeah, no. Millenarianism, as they said, that was something that emerged in a lot of these burned over district places, with just this idea that we're lurching towards like an apocalypse in our lifetime.
1,000 years of fire, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, people need something like a hard deadline to work towards.
I don't know, that personally wouldn't get me more excited. I mean, when I was a little boy and 2012 was fast approaching, I literally thought I might die in the apocalypse because I was that young and dumb. But yeah, that didn't make me happy.
How about Y2K? Do you have any memories of that? You saw the movie, didn't you? Right?
Yeah, but we're going to be doing a Y2K Futurism episode, so I'll save that.
But yeah, so the Bahá'í Faith.
Oh yeah, the Bahá'í Faith. So this one has a very close connection to Chicago, but it originated in Iran in the early 19th century, and it's monotheistic, but unlike a lot of other NRMs, it doesn't ask converts to abandon their old religion. Instead, it asks them to build on it and reinterpret it. Because according to Baha'i teachings, religion is revealed in an orderly, progressive way by a single God through manifestations of God, who are the founders of major world religions throughout human history. The Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad are cited as the most recent manifestations of God before the Bab and the Baha'u'llah. Okay,
Yeah.
I kind of butchered the last one.
No, you did a pretty good job of that. I would guess, as if I'm anyone to judge. But yeah, that's a theme you see in a lot of NRMs, is what I call like adopting religious figures, where they take like great figures from the past and they say like, actually, these are all part of the same set of people that are our people.
Yeah.
And it really like lends credibility to a new movement, because that's something that new movements struggle with. They need to attach themselves onto established symbols of piety or knowledge.
Yeah, but this is sort of the farthest back you can go to the sort of coexist bumper sticker idea of like all religions are true and valid. And New Age spirituality, I'm sure, has a connection to the Bahá'í Faith in some way.
100%. Yeah. It seems like such an inoffensive religion, but it caused a huge stir in Iran at the time.
Yeah.
Like the first figure of the movement, the Bab, he died when he was 30. He had his revelation at 24. And he was executed by the state at 30. Like that was his he created a following in that very short time. But before he passed, he said that there was going to be someone who would like take up the mantle after his passing. That ended up being the Baha'u'llah. I'm going to choose to pronounce that. But yeah, and then so it picked up followers much more so under the second leader. And then there was a third leader as well. And so it even made it to America.
Yeah. And I think that like this religion in the United States, it appeals to people who are generally a bit more liberal, because within the liberal moral matrix, fairness and care for others are very important. The fact that this religion doesn't minimize any other people's faith, I think, is appealing to people who have that worldview. And the Bahá'í Faith, there are 8 continental Bahá'í houses of worship. I've always called the temple here the Bahá'í Temple, but it's the Bahá'í House of Worship. But yeah, the one for North America is in Wilmette, Illinois, which is a community up on the North Shore. It's at the end of the Purple Line, so you can get there taking the Chicago CTA. And it's this really beautiful structure with 9 sides, 9 doors, 9 gardens, 9 fountains. It's almost entirely symmetrical. And it's open to visitors who are not part of the Bahá'í Faith. And I've never been there when there's a ceremony going on.
No, yeah.
So it's like, it's not like you walk through the door and there's people trying to convert you. It's actually very open. So pretty much every Chicagoan has been there.
Yeah, no, it's a great little like weekend thing to do. They also have air conditioning and nice restrooms. So cyclists stop by there. A lot of times I always stop there on my way up.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's hard to imagine that place getting built today, because it's a whole neighborhood of these like very nice homes.
Yeah.
Like the North Shore in Chicago is like the best suburbs, essentially. There's Evanston, Wilmette, Winnetka, and Kenilworth on the inside of that too. And these are like, this is as good as it gets, like fancy house-wise. And then just inexplicably a giant white temple to a guy who died in Iran in the 1850s.
Yeah. And it's surprising too that it started to get constructed there, but also that it got finished. Because I didn't know this before this week, but it was started in 1912, but only finished in 1953. So the fact that NIMBYs didn't manage to kill the project is like truly a miracle.
Yeah, and I think that like it started its construction like pre-World War I, and it ended post-World War II. Like the construction methods that have changed after that, and like you could live and die in that time. It'd be a premature death, but still, like that's crazy. And it got done. And it's like, it's hard to imagine that happening in a neighborhood like that nowadays, because I have done work on the North Shore and those people are grumpy. Those people don't want anything to change. I was doing a renovation of a historic, like Daniel Burnham designed schoolhouse built in 1898. And we had to unload stuff through the alleyway. And this one homeowner got really mad at us. And he yelled, there shouldn't even be a school here. This is a residential neighborhood. And I'm like, your grandfather died before like this place, like, or died after this place would be built. Like, it's crazy how long the school building has been around here. Like, you shouldn't be here if you can't take it. You bought the house. You know what you're signing up for.
Did you say something? I hope
no, of course. This is all in my mind, Nathan. Come on.
I don't know. I've seen you in public sometimes tell people to not drive or ride their bike a certain way. I would hope that you would call out NIMBYs in public.
One would hope, but no, I guess I'm a coward.
Yeah. But yeah, we actually know someone in our friend group who is considering converting to Baha'i. Mm-hmm. And he started to try to have conversations with Baha'i worshipers in Chicago. And he had found that like it doesn't seem to be as serious as he would like, because the way that they practice their religion is typically inside of people's homes, and they're called devotionals. And from their perspective, it didn't seem like the religion was as structured to make it like sort of worth it, because for everyone he met with, like he wanted to join a community and there wasn't a solid one there to like really join.
Yeah, interesting. It just doesn't really ask enough of its followers. I like that our friend like recognized that. Like, no, you want to have some like buy-in. You know, I think that's a very good approach, because people do kind of come at religion like, all right, what can you do for me? Like a very functionalist view of it. And it's nice that they were looking into these religions and being like, all right, what can we do for this? Like, how can we contribute? And then just seeing that it was kind of informal. And yeah, Baha'i has been struggling with
It sounds like they have.
Yeah, since 2000 or so, it's been on the decline, which is kind of a shame. I just feel like there's such an interesting, like, little bit of variety.
Yeah, and I feel like the reason it's on the decline might be similar for the reason like Esperanza has become less popular. Just Esperanto. Yeah, but just the idea that like we are all going to come together as one people and flatten our cultural differences. It doesn't feel like we're in that world. That's like a 90s idea.
Yeah.
We're not all like UN delegates thinking this way.
Yeah. I mean, collapse of things like Pan-Africanism as well. Like just this idea that we can like flatten cultural differences and emerge
I don't
united.
think people want that, because we're clinging to the few that we still have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now we're going to jump ahead a bit to more modern NRMs and to ones that kind of fit more squarely within the definition of cult.
Yeah.
So there were like definitely like NRMs pop up every decade, it seems. And there were some definitely in like the early 1900s, even in the like 1930s, like Great Depression and stuff, kind of trading in language around the revivals, like the second revival. But it's really like during this post-war 70s and 80s period that you get some pretty like pretty different cults is what I'd say. So the one I want to bring up, because I think it shows like a shift in how irreligious you can make a cult and still like have it function, which is Bob Meehan and Enthusiastic Sobriety, or ES as we'll call it. So this was a very charismatic guy who was an alcoholic and then got sober, learned all the AA handbook stuff, and then went about saying that he's got an improved system off of it that can really help kids with drug problems. And this is the 70s. This is when this was really becoming a problem.
Yeah.
And so he started these communities where a hospital would pay him money and he would take the kid and he would get him sober again. And then he'd use that kid to help get other kids sober.
Yeah. And this, like, his idea of enthusiastic sobriety, it's interesting for me to think about as a straight edge person, because it doesn't sound that appealing, but also I can see how it would work, because essentially his idea was that temperance, the sort of like straight-laced Protestant way of approaching sobriety, isn't fun. People won't want to do it unless it's fun. So he wanted to encourage people in the ES program to do things like smoke, dance, swear, have like rowdy times with people, even if they're not on substances. But yeah, it doesn't appeal to me, but I have noticed a connection where like people who have struggled with substances pick up smoking, because it's one of the few vices they can have where it doesn't destroy their interpersonal relationships.
Oh yeah,
it does happen.
Yeah, coffee and cigarettes are always the things you see at AA meetings.
Yeah, yeah. Like I went to Milwaukee maybe a year or two ago, and I happened to be staying at their largest hotel when it was hosting a recovery convention. And I'll say that entering or exiting the building, like 100 people would always be smoking outside.
Oh my God. Yeah. And so, yeah, Meehan's approach like took that AA recovery kind of mindset, because they want you to foster connections. You know, it's very isolating to be an addict. And so he brings together people who are all experiencing the same trauma and trouble, and they connect with each other. And then, you know, the next step you're supposed to have after that is you then reintegrate with the world. You know, you connect with your family that maybe you've neglected in being an addict, and you get gainful employment. And so his thing was kind of arresting you before that happened. He would just promote you up the ladder, and now you're like a counselor. And so you'd have these like 20-something-year-old kids in charge of 17-year-old kids. And it was disorganized. It was rife with abuse. Yeah. Definitely. A lot of it by Meehan, but also like his son-in-law, this guy with the last name Stonebreaker, always stands out to me. Kind of cool last name. But essentially like a second generation form that realized what a good racket they had, that they were pulling in money from either families or from hospital systems, and they kept this going. And there's an article about this in the Atavist magazine, which I love for long-form journalism. It's called The Love Bomb. And they talk with this guy, Dave Cherry, who was a part of the worst bits of the cult. And he talked about how he had gotten the wrong side of Meehan. And basically his wife was like taken away from him. They're just like, all right, your wife's going to go live with Dave, and you're going to go out into the desert and think about what you've done. And so he was on his way out for his self-imposed exile. Like, no one was forcing him to do this. He was like driving out there because he was so believing in the ES system and that he had done something wrong. And then he just was at the gas station. He realized that like the kind of bubbly woman behind the gas station counter was having a better time, and she wasn't thinking about enthusiastic sobriety, and her loved one wasn't getting whisked away to go live with a cult leader in his compound. And then he just kind of like turned his car around and went back. I feel like you don't see a lot of stories like that in cults of someone just having like a eureka aha moment.
Yeah. And I first learned about the ES movement a bit through like a troubled teen industry documentary, because as you said, the way that Bob Meehan would get kickbacks from hospitals for referring teens to like treatment programs that were relatively expensive, that model, then all these troubled teen industry programs popped up, and they actually started to get worse because enthusiastic sobriety in the beginning, it wasn't really as abusive. It sounded like it could have some problems, but it did seem like it was working, and it wasn't as like widespread. But yeah, later on, once you get to the 90s, that's when you get these like wilderness therapy programs that really destroyed kids' lives, and took it to the extreme.
Yeah, it's something we'll talk about is that NRMs really reach out to people who are struggling in their lives and don't have like a sense of self or purpose. And so this kind of just like doesn't wait for them to come. It doesn't wait for those people to come to them. It like actively goes to hospitals and seeks like, all right, who's on your rolls? Who comes in all the time ODing? It's just like, it's so brutally efficient in a way that's really scary.
NRMs will recruit vulnerable people sometimes, though, like with Rajneeshis, which we're going to get to next. Like they actually would recruit homeless people. But, you know, with Bob Meehan and enthusiastic sobriety, you might question, like, why are we talking about it on this episode? Like, where's the religious part? And I think it's because Bob Meehan was such, like, a beloved figure by the people in his program. He seemed like a schlumpy guy. I was kind of surly, but the kids who gravitated towards the program, they liked that he was an adult who was letting them have fun, and they gravitated towards him in a semi-religious manner.
Yeah. It's like he used a lot of like religious statements in the beginning, and then this just kind of fell away. Like it was a cult of personality above all else.
You know, it's a very long article. I kind of forget. Was he Christian? Was the program Christian?
At the start.
Okay.
And by the end, he was saying some pretty terrible stuff. He was like, I think he arrives at a place that a lot of NRM leaders get, which is that like, I'm God. Like I am your world.
Far too common.
Another case of that is the People's Temple movement, which this is maybe one of the most classic cults in people's minds. I was kind of like wondering whether or not to include this one.
Yeah, because we're not trying to talk about like 900 people killing themselves.
Yeah.
We don't want to get into all the salacious details, but I think that we want to bring it up just because it's like, of all the NRMs, this is the one that's most appropriate to call a cult. And it had the most like extreme, shocking, and violent ending, you know, like with Jim Jones, the US government knew that there were problems at Jonestown in Guyana. And then a congressman visited Jonestown. As he was leaving there, they weren't happy with the results. They thought that there would be more people coming to investigate them. They tried and successfully assassinated him before he left. And then he ordered all of them to kill themselves by drinking poisoned Kool-Aid. But you actually, you wrote it wasn't Kool-Aid.
It was not Kool-Aid. Kool-Aid really caught a stray on this. It's Flavor Aid. A lot cheaper, more commercially available.
It's a very like 70s name.
Yeah, it is. And so we would have bags of this probably from the 70s in the fraternity house. And we call this bug juice. You ever heard this term?
I have heard of that.
Yeah, it's made
like a Goosebumps word.
Yeah, that's a good word for it. But yeah, it's because it's dyed with red dye 40, which is made from crushed up bugs. And so I think it was like soldiers in Vietnam would call it bug juice. And our fraternity was very influenced by like military culture and stuff, because there was a lot of soldiers.
I would rather the dye come from bugs than like petroleum.
Yeah, that's something. Given the choice between bugs and petroleum,
I would rather that.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Jonestown, I mean, just started off as very in the church tradition, but Jim Jones built this large congregation drawing from cities. He was really active in the desegregation of Indianapolis, which is impressive, before like ending up at the state of like Bob Meehan and all that, where it's all about control. He declared himself to be God. He said there was an apocalypse coming. I think Jonestown forms a lot of the language around cults that we use nowadays. It's the like epitome of one.
Yeah.
And the senator they killed, this is plenty of
Congressman.
Congressman. You're
right.
Yeah. Plenty of congressmen have been assassinated, but he's the only one who's been assassinated in the line of duty, which is like, to go check in on his constituents, essentially, which is crazy. And it was, depending on how you measure it, one of the largest losses of U.S. civilian life until 9/11.
Yeah. And like 9/11, there's media that came out of the event that's socially palatable to distribute and watch, I made this like short list of just things where it's like, you can watch 9/11 videos on YouTube because the deaths happened at a distance.
Yeah,
we censor the people jumping from buildings, but otherwise it's like acceptable to distribute and watch it. And then recently with the Trump assassination attempt, there was just the tiniest amount of blood. It was just like, if it was a Hollywood movie, if it was a PG-13 movie, it was just totally like, it didn't cross a line, and then that can be disseminated freely. And then with Jonestown, it's crazy because like there's no visuals to accompany it, but there's like a 40-minute recording of all the people at Jonestown dying. And I've listened to part of it. It is disturbing, but when something hits the sweet spot where we have taboos around disseminating images or audio of death, and but when it hits this sweet spot, it's like, I don't even know how to feel about it. It's like you get to think about these mass casualties in a way that collectively we never would be able to otherwise.
Yeah, it's such like a hard, amount of life to think about and to like consume in that way.
Yeah, because I've said it before. I've never really gone into depth with it, but I believe in free speech. I'm a free speech absolutist, but images of death, I think, need to be censored because we can't become desensitized to them. Like I actually had boycotted Reddit for a very long time because they had a subreddit called Watch People Die.
Yeah.
And I just was really opposed to its existence.
But they got rid of it.
Yeah.
Right?
What?
Yeah. They got rid of it, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's why I joined eventually. I actually joined it because I like Steven Universe, I think. My oldest posts go back to that.
Interesting. Active commenter on the Steven Universe subreddit. Yeah. Another movement around this time, but taking a lot more like Eastern influence, was the Rajneesh Movement.
Yeah. And I've been watching the Wild Wild Country documentary this week. I'm rewatching it. I loved it.
It's a great one.
Around it, and I loved it this time. It's so good.
It's it's more compassionate than I think a lot of stories about NRMs. And it has the strange situation where a lot of people still believe in it,
I feel like most of them, I mean, even for example, I was reading about how I didn't mention this in the Mormonism part, but there was a Mormon kingdom on Beaver Island.
Yeah.
The federal government ended up destroying it. But I read that there's still 300 congregates somewhere else, like who were followers of this Mormon king who still are that branch of Mormon. Anyway, these things can go on a lot longer than you'd expect. But with the Rajneesh movement, the main leader, Rajneesh, he's also known as Osho and Bhagwan. He has several names, but we'll just call him Rajneesh. But he was an Indian guru who gained a massive following, and he started to be persecuted in his home country of India. And then his followers made this elaborate plan that they executed where they brought him and their whole group over to Antelope, Oregon, or they bought land that was adjacent to it. And then they started to build a city from scratch called Rajneeshpuram. And yeah, this got really wild.
It's such an interesting, it drew from a lot of New Age style thinking, but something we'll talk about in a lot of these NRMs is that this was claiming to find like a third way between pure spiritualism and then living in the material capital world. And so they didn't have all these like absolutes, like living a life of squalor. Rajneesh would drive around in Rolls Royces, and they had like adherents who were, this was in the 80s, they had adherents who were like stockbrokers on Wall Street and would just send a portion of their earnings like to the group. And then they also had hardliners who would live there with them. But they drew from very educated people. But then they also, as they started to grow Rajneeshpuram in Oregon, they needed a little more political will in terms of voting to get things done in the county level. And so they started shipping in homeless people from major cities. But the PR on that is just fascinating, because they were saying like, all right, these cities don't want these people, but if we take them, you yell at us. Like, what do you want to be done with these forgotten people? And the answer is that like they were just using these people as pawns, essentially. But they were like turning a mirror to America in a lot of ways, but to avoid looking at themselves. I don't know, my ex and I watched Wild Wild Country together like pretty shortly after it came out, and we kind of got into it a bit because she's like, I see nothing wrong with what they're doing. Is what she was saying, because she likes being out in nature and all that, and she's skeptical of the whole rat race thing, as am I. But I don't know, it's something I'll get into here, but I want to believe there is a third way. That like, I mean, I get unfulfilled at my job sometimes, and I have, I think, one of the most fulfilling jobs of anyone in my friend group. Like, I get to create beautiful things, and still you can feel like you're in the doldrums of it sometimes. And so I'm interested in anyone who's willing to like break out of it and figure out something. But Rajneesh was not the utopia they were making it out to be.
Yeah. My personal opinion on it was that I think it should have had the right to exist. I think that what the local, state, and then federal government were doing was aggravating them, and they should have had religious freedom. I think that even when NRMs become more cult-like, federal government interference usually is a tipping point that causes mass casualties.
Yeah.
And I don't think that they should have gotten involved. But my personal opinion, though, is that it gave up the best things about religion and it kept the worst parts, where it's like, the extraction that I acknowledge does happen on behalf of churches amongst people who are like vulnerable or poor to then prop up religious leaders and then pay for really nice buildings and churches. They were doing that like to the extreme. They were taking people's entire inheritances. That was not okay. So they kept that, but then they gave up most of the moral and religious ethical framework that religions provide. Like they were espousing free love. Like they were saying things like, oh, you can't do drugs, but there was some structure, but it was this like new age, like, oh, you can figure it out for yourself. Like if you like Buddha a bit more than Jesus, like feel free to read or do whatever.
It's wishy-washy.
Yeah. I don't like that.
No, I like when there's a clear like eschatology or cosmology, like when they have it, I don't know, clearly defined and they have like a set of things to work from. I hate the feeling that these like are just being made up on the fly. And Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, the leader, like his performances or his speaking series are very bizarre when you watch them, but he was captivating. You can kind of see that bit of it there. But yeah, essentially he took a vow of silence, and then his second in command, Sheila, who was like his personal assistant, became the outward facing like leader of the group. And in order to secure more political power, going back to those elections, they planned a bioterrorism attack where they would give a whole bunch of regular people in the town who were going to vote against the Rajneesh, they would give them food poisoning so they couldn't vote the next day. And so it's the largest bioterrorism attack on U.S. soil.
It wasn't just planned. They did do it.
Yeah.
Yes. I think over 700 people got poisoned. No one died, thankfully, which could have happened because it was salmonella.
Yeah.
But they did plan other things, too, that were pretty extreme. Like at one point in the documentary, they mentioned a plan to like grind up a beaver and put it in the water supply.
Just insane stuff. Super villain stuff. But yeah, Sheila's an interesting case study. When I was like doing some more research.
What pathology do you think she has?
Narcissist is too easy. I would say. I don't know. There's a bit in the documentary she lost someone she loved earlier than all this before she rose to power.
Oh yeah, that was so heartwarming. I actually kind of teared up.
Yeah.
It was really sweet.
No, and so I think that like that can really change someone. I think you can just like, if you've given up on like love in that way, or maybe he was someone who kind of like kept her tethered to people, I think she just became a lot more Machiavellian after that.
Yeah.
And then she got prosecuted, served her time, and then started working at an elderly care home in Switzerland.
Yeah, I mean, it's so crazy that all these elderly people are trusting her now. I personally wouldn't really trust her with an elderly family member.
No.
But yeah.
But she has a lot of like compilations and edits on YouTube. They're just like girl boss. Like people have like recast her in this like rarely behaved women. Was it well-behaved women rarely make history? Most savage Sheila moments. I'm like, what is that? Yeah. Are we so like low on good, powerful female role models that only cult leaders will do? Like, what is this? Like, just. I
mean, Lori Lightfoot does well.
Yeah,
memes, but
yeah, no, it's true. Just go watch a Lori Lightfoot being savage compilation.
Yeah, but no, I actually right after this premiered in 2018, I watched like a Modern interview she did where she like interrupts the newscaster a bunch of times and then exits the interview.
Yeah.
Like,
savage. Girl boss. Exactly.
Still the same way.
Snap.
Yeah. But yeah, one thing I did like about the movement was that there was a really beautiful uniform. They all wore like reds and oranges.
Yeah. It was very good.
Very 70s.
Yeah, it's very 70s, nice, strong jewel tones. And it's, I don't know, better than just the all white. I feel like that's the easiest cult aesthetic to go for, is like white, purity, renewal, like washing ourselves free of past religious stuff. It's just boo, get some new material. Get purple robes.
Yeah, I mean, across NRMs, uniforms don't pop up as much as you might think. Like Mormons have like LDS mandated underwear, and Heaven's Gate followers, they had matching like funerary attire, but you don't see it as much as you'd think. I'd kind of prefer if they did it more often, but they don't want to look like freaks at the same time.
Yeah, it's one of those. It's them like constantly trying to toe the line between like enforcing conformity in their members, but also not attracting the ire of the outside. And then now that like we have enough language built around cults and recognizing them, like the average person has a little more built-in skepticism I think someone would have had in the 60s before all of these. And so I think cults have to be sneakier in how they find you nowadays.
Yeah, it's so easy to get information now. Like you can just Google a group and then find out how problematic it is, which brings us to our last new religious movement that we do really want to call a cult, which is Twin Flames Universe. And this is sort of the most modern cult in a way, because it popped up over Zoom post-pandemic. It started as like a life coaching service for desperate women who wanted to fall in love, and the program would encourage them to think of someone they had a crush on as being their twin flame, this person they were going to be with eternally. And then they would end up stalking and harassing them, and there'd be charges filed. And then the program kept going. They realized like, oh, we can just set members up, but there weren't enough men in the group. So then they started to pair up women, even if they weren't lesbians, and then would encourage one of the two to transition.
It's the craziest, like just solving each problem step by step and not thinking of it. Because the next step after that is like, they then start talking like, all right, you found your twin flame. It's you, another woman, even though neither of you were lesbians before, but you are now. And one of them is transitioned to a male, but you can't have biological children. So what's the solution to this? So now they're going to connect you with a sperm donor in the group, or it's just Jeff, I think, also as well, the leader. And then so that way you can have your golden child together, who is the third twin flame in your relationship.
Oh my gosh, I forgot that part. A third twin flame? That doesn't
exactly
even make sense.
Like this is what really, I mean, obviously what should piss me off about cults is the loss of human life and potential, but it's the inconsistent, like making it up as you go along kind of stuff. Like I hate that stuff. I think they're getting worse and worse over time. Like, not to always be the grump of this podcast, like, oh, people don't dress like they used to. Our cities are ugly and all that. And it's like, and our cults don't even have good doctrines anymore. They're just making it up as they go along. They're like half remembering new age like concepts that have been done to death since the 70s about like your inner child.
Yeah, I think like Mormonism and Baha'i provide frameworks for how to live your life that are so much more comprehensive than like the other groups we've talked about. Yeah, I feel like new religious movements are better when they're like that. But, you know, I did read up like about how the leader, Jeffrey Devine, has actually claimed that he's Jesus. There's an article I'll link where they say like in a video conference, the IANs announced a revelation about the second coming of Christ. According to the couple, historical artworks depicting Jesus share a prophetic resemblance to Jeff. He's not coincidental.
He's just a white man with a beard and a strong nose. I'll give him that.
And long hair that he usually wears as a man bun, which is also a red flag. But yeah, Jeff Devine is the second coming of Christ that ANs claimed in a conference call announcing to their members he was no longer just a CEO or spiritual guru.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And then kind of tangential to Twin Flames and maybe kind of like sapping off of them was the Love Has Won cult, which also got the Netflix docuseries treatment.
I didn't see that one.
It's a wild one. So Amy Carlson was the leader of that cult, and she just the most out there kind of speak. It doesn't even, not even like intelligible, I would say. They just talk about different energy levels. They complain about how this world is 3D, but they're trying to ascend to a 4D or maybe even a 5D existence. And so they had a very dedicated group of followers. They were also soliciting online donations through these crazy live streams. And they took that idea of like sampling past religious figures, but they like amped it up for the 21st century, where they would say that there were these, I'm just gonna say like mystics. I forget what the actual term for it was, but they have these people that Amy Carlson, by drinking large amounts of alcohol and colloidal silver, would commune with these mystics. And they included, of course, Jesus Christ, like Buddha, all the classics, but also Robin Williams and Marilyn Monroe, Elvis, just like the most
Donald
basic
Trump too,
pop
right?
stars. Yes, and a lot of dead people, except for Donald Trump, who's
Oh
the
my
only like
gosh.
living. She was also communing with him too. And then they, I mean, just kind of brazenly trying to get whatever lost souls they could. They attached onto QAnon as well, and like anti-COVID conspiracy
It's the
stuff.
most schizophrenic thing I can think of.
It's most purely schizophrenic. And like I compare it to you mentioned the Heaven's Gate cult earlier, and their stuff was of course bonkers, but it was consistent. There was yes, it adapted over time, but there was like a UFO coming that would pick all of them up, and they had this very clearly lineated like theology.
I hate that when I look at one of these and the leader isn't actually charismatic, like Jeff, from Twin Flames. It's like I wouldn't even want to talk to the guy.
Yeah,
like he's lame. But yeah, with Heaven's Gate, I watched like some videos of the leader of that talking, and it was just this like creepy boomer. Didn't see the appeal either.
Applewhite. Yeah, that's an interesting pairing. You got to give him points for uniqueness because he was like a closeted gay man who was cohabitating with like a much older straight woman. And so that, I don't think you've seen a cult set up like that before, because usually it's two crazy people in love or a single guy.
Yeah.
Amy Carlson, just a single woman who would then acquire a father god for a period, like a boyfriend, until she needed like a different one. And then that one would be like demoted, then she'd get a new father god. But yeah, we'll talk about her more in the next bit here. But yeah, kind of like, why are we even talking about NRMs? Like, how does this fit within our deal?
Yeah, I think that a central thesis has emerged across all the episodes that we've done. I talked about this when I made a post about how I rewrote the description of the podcast, and it got like more likes than most posts. Everyone seemed jazzed about it. I was happy to see that. But we keep thinking about how the car-oriented development and urban renewal that happened in the mid-century, how there have been cultural consequences where people today are not personally fulfilled in many different avenues. And I think that NRMs appeal to people, particularly the ones that popped up starting in like the 60s, 70s, 80s. They appealed to boomers who were the first generation raised in the suburbs. And these appealed to people not necessarily because of their religious qualities, but instead of thinking that like, oh, we need to abandon suburbia, go to the cities, live with more people, have more social interactions. Instead, they got the idea like, oh, we need to move further away from society, get out into nature, and just abandon all of the social norms even further than our parents did. And I think that was a big mistake.
Mm-hmm. And it's just, I mean, we touched on like the counterculture of the 60s a lot too. It just seems, I try and put myself in their shoes, but it just seems so ungrateful that they see that like their parents had access to working a job and getting a house, and they're like, God, I would hate that. It's like, oh my God, that seems so impossible for us. Like,
yeah.
And so it was, this rejection of the rat race, and also not seeing answers in conventional religion either. And so people were falling away from that, but they needed something that like was sufficiently different from the religion they were raised with.
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to my dad last night, who is pretty squarely a boomer, because we were talking about religion. He'd brought up how for him, like organized religion just never made sense or appealed to him. And I think it was because he grew up in a world where like you were expected to obey authority and have structure and follow rules. And then now our generation, it's like, wait, we need those. Like, this is a mess.
We threw too much out. Yeah. But on like the kind of interplay between like, the commune being so far out from urban areas, I think that NRMs often do start in urban areas where there is the density and the connections between people that you can pull in. You can recruit a lot easier, and then people can recruit their friends, and you can pull webs of people in. And then once you have that critical mass, then the city becomes a threat to you, because there's also people who can pull your followers out of it.
Yeah.
They have interactions with people outside of their sphere. So then with that, you kind of self-suburbanize in a way, and you go as far out as you can, or to like have your commune.
Yeah, I mean, going from like San Francisco to Guyana, I mean, that's a wild distance.
Yeah, and it's like, this makes me very scared, because Twin Flames is looking to get money to buy their own compound out in Michigan, I believe.
Oh, I don't know the state, but yeah, that's another reason that like you should call it a cult in the present day in order to identify it as one, because the documentary Escaping Twin Flames, they suggested that things are not over and they're probably going to escalate if this happens. Like once everyone's in a closed compound, something like Jonestown is far more likely to happen.
Yeah, you're entering like kind of a spiral period of that NRM where it's like, all right, what's next?
But I get why they want to live communally, because how everyone feels so alone in the modern world, the Western world, like living in close proximity to people makes a big difference. Like I happen to live across the street from a friend. Which is kind of wild. I met her after we'd both moved in. That was not intentional. But like just having access to someone that close is kind of unthinkable in today's world.
No. Yeah. Like it's what I want very badly, because like I was in a fraternity for 4 years. I was living communally with friends. It was so affordable. There were all those social connections. We would jokingly call ourselves a cult. Of course, we had shared rituals and we had secret rituals and stuff. So like there's cult-like behavior there. And so I was always wondering, like, oh, co-op housing, like maybe that's the thing. It's always a little like lefty woo-woo. And so I stayed at a friend's co-op housing thing in Austin, Texas. And it's just like the fraternity, there's shared chores, there's shared common areas. There's like some guiding principles. There's an interview process, but it was all much more lax than the fraternity. And it showed. Like it was dirty. There were people there. You were supposed to be like a student at the school in order to be a part of this. But there's clearly a guy who dropped out and became a drug dealer and was operating out of the co-op. And so I'm like, I think this place needs more cult-like behavior in here to like actually enforce norms and enforce like pro-social things in there. I don't know. I really want to believe that there is a better way than like me living in a small studio with a kitchen. It feels a little useless sometimes. Like I'm just a single guy. Like it would make more sense if I had communal meals with friends,
Would you be friends with the people in your building? Have you met them?
I've tried. There's an old German grandma. It's a building full of studios, so it's all like yuppies like me, and then an old German grandma who I talk to sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, in my neighborhood, like Avondale is such like a broad amalgamation of people. It appeals to local Chicagoans, people who work at O'Hare, people who are like struggling artists, immigrants. It's like the average amount of time people stay in the neighborhood is like 2 years.
Oh, wow.
So I don't live in a place where like I feel like other people are putting down roots as long as I've been here. Like I've been here 8 years, but yeah, it would be nice to have that, to actually know your neighbors, because I don't really feel that now.
Yeah, but it's just like we should give people an option other than joining a cult. It feels like people are given this false dichotomy of like live in an alienating suburban or just alienating city experience, or go to Rajneesh prom.
Yeah. And also on this, David P. Barrett wrote in The New Believers that new religions, they primarily attract teens and people in their 20s who are typically white in the Western world. Outside of the Western world, it's typically people who are more working class, the poor and oppressed. But here, for whatever reason, it is the exact demographic that we've been speculating that new religions appeal to. People raised in suburbia, the white middle class. They're the people who feel like something's typically missing.
Yeah. It's interesting. What I'm kind of thinking of for this is when I went to Israel, I went to this like mystic town, this town that's like associated with Kabbalah, which is the mystic side of Judaism.
Yeah.
And I met two different people who were working there. Like one was a tour guide and one was an artist. And they both had an eerily similar life story about how they grew up in some like Jewish suburb of a major city. And then they, after like high school or college, they went east in search of like new age spirituality and to find fulfillment. And they didn't find it there. And so they returned to Judaism, but in a more mystical sense. And like the fact that these can keep on happening independently, that like there is something about the suburban ennui that just like shoots people out. And they either land in new age beliefs or like return to a modified version of the ones they grew up in.
Something I like saying to people who are a little lost in life or questioning their behavior is that I'll say kind of coyly, "Oh, you're waiting to get saved." It really like takes them off guard because they don't think that that's the solution, but it's good to throw that at them.
Yeah, but it's like, do you have any other ideas? Do you have any better ideas? Do you have any other plans to change things around?
Yeah. So what are our personal opinion on NRMs? I think it's interesting that out the gate, you recommended this episode and you were like, I want to do new religious movements instead of cults, because that's the term I've always preferred, because I've always had the opinion that like the only thing you can be that's bad necessarily is nothing, atheism. I think it leads to nihilism. I've always viewed NRMs with a bit more respect than other people. I've been inclined to view them as legitimate.
Yeah, I guess I have a little more innate skepticism towards it, but I think it comes out of like a jealousy. That's what I said earlier. Kind of like, oh, you think you figured it out? Like, of course, life is boring. Of course, we're working towards nothing. It feels, and like we're lacking milestones in life and community. Like, obviously, but just like stick it out, which is what I've been doing. And so, I think I just don't like that smugness of like, oh, I found the way, because I wish I could believe in that. Like, I wish I could have that kind of worldview. Not that I'm insanely nihilistic or something. And I never call myself realistic. I hate people who call themselves realists. None of us know what's real.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was the angle I was coming from. I just have a personal interest in kind of like observing the commonalities between them and like all these different attempts at like clawing at a better life.
Yeah. It's not very popular amongst the people who study NRMs to try to find commonalities. They're like a lot of academics where they think, oh, these ideas are so complex, you can't come to a basic definition or consensus. Mm-hmm. That's just them thinking about it too much. Like, you definitely can.
Yeah, no, it shows like that's what's fun about what we get to do, is that we're not like immersed in that world all the time where we just start to drive ourselves insane and saying like, oh, you can't categorize anything actually. And it's like, well, I think we can try.
Yeah, it makes me think about Louise Perry, where she had studied feminist studies, I think, in college, but now she went on to write The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. Yeah. But she was saying like her discipline, her field, it's not valued to speak candidly. Like the way that she talks about things so forwardly, like, oh yes, it's like this, it's not great. People don't, in those disciplines, they don't usually like if you're this straightforward.
Yeah, you can't assert things. Like, you just need to talk obliquely about everything. Yeah. So one of the through lines I see throughout a lot of NRMs is, especially like, Mormonism is pushing it. These are all like in around the Industrial Revolution and afterwards. This is like post-Enlightenment around the Industrial Revolution, and so a lot of NRMs try and synthesize science and religion.
Oh yeah,
to mixed effect. I don't think any of them actually do it. Like, but I wonder what their fascination is with that. I think it's because they're touching something that the old religions won't touch.
Yeah. I mean, I think their ability to incorporate things from the modern world is one of their biggest strengths, but it also opens them up for a lot more skepticism, and then ultimately the ability to fully discredit them, as is the case with Joseph Smith and the papyri. Yeah. But you might benefit from being able to incorporate scientific ideas that are true now, but then if it later turns out that scientists are like, that wasn't right, it just completely discredits what you're saying.
Yeah, no, it's like the Mormons doing phrenology back in the day and then like kind of dispensing with it, as the rest of the world did. I think the kind of like the organization of cults is interesting because there's always usually a like central charismatic figure at first. That's the one thing unites them. Sometimes it can be two. Right? Never three is what I'd say. But I think that oftentimes the second in commands are sometimes the most interesting. Yeah. Like we talked about Ma Anand Sheela from the Rajneesh Movement. And I mean, Rajneesh was electric in his own way, his kind of like unblinking eyes and stilted delivery that like kept you waiting on each word. Yeah. But she was just decisive and uncompromising. I think it just requires like raw organizational ability and like, I don't know, compromise too. Not something you think about in cults who seem uncompromising, but a large enough cult is going to have different power centers, And so to like get everyone on the same page and in lockstep through either fear or bargaining is amazing ability. She could have killed it in the corporate world if she wasn't. I guess it was essentially a corporation. The Rajneeshs even had their own like corporation just to operate the Rolls Royces, like tax wise. Like they were really on it. Like they had lawyers as a part of their recruits.
Yeah, and in the documentary they bring up how there were these Hollywood elites that started to gravitate towards Bhagwan, and they started to gain influence over him. And then Sheila was at her most furious at Bhagwan when she found out that he was telling them to start a new corporation that would have separate affairs from what she was doing at Rajneesh Param. Yeah. But yeah.
Insane. So yeah, other like famous second in commands, Brigham Young with the Mormons. So he was like, not blood related to Joseph Smith or Hiram Smith, who was Joseph Smith's brother.
I think was even more impressive than what Joseph Smith did in his lifetime, which was founding Salt Lake City, which is such a major city today.
Yeah.
The state of Utah in general is actually one of the wealthiest states. Like there are studies that show that if it had lower religiosity, it would vote the same way as Colorado. It would be just as blue. It's only still red because of Mormonism. But he did screw up though in that he legitimized plural marriage for Mormons for a generation, which bit them in the butt. It's always used to discredit them now. But I don't know that much about him though. Do you know what he was like, his personality or anything?
I think he had to do multiple things. He was like a city planner on one level with Salt Lake City, a military leader in the Mormon Wars, like a religious leader. And then that kind of skill I was taught, a manager as well. Yeah, a God warrior. But yeah, I think that the secret to the Mormons surviving to today, when everything else from the Second Great Awakening is mostly fallen away, Seventh-day Adventists kind of came out of Millerites, so they're still around.
Yeah.
But Mormons are always able to, like, when they absolutely have to, capitulate to people. And so that was stuff like giving up polygamy.
Yeah.
So when they gave up polygamy, that angered a portion of their like group, and so that splintered off and did their own thing. That's the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints groups. It allowed the greater kind of group to move on by cleaving off the most radical bits. And so even if people think that there are strange things about the contemporary LDS church, like think about how much they've jettisoned in their past just in order to enter polite society. Like men used to grow full beards in Mormonism well after beards went away in the 1920s. And then they stopped wearing beards when like counterculture came around, basically, because hippies were wearing beards. And then Mormons like, oh no, we can't have that at all.
They look so much better clean shaven.
Yeah, it makes sense with the whole look. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think an interesting group to talk about. I don't know, might cut this out, but the Nation of Islam, I think, is worth studying because the founder there, Wallace Fard Muhammad, according to like contemporary scholarship, they think that this guy was just a white guy pretending to be an Arab selling Islam to black people, which is a fascinating character study in his own sense. But his successor, Elijah Muhammad, I believe, like truly believed in the mission and the project of using Islam to liberate black people from the structures of America. And I think cult secession crises are so interesting because this is one thing that does connect them with established religions, like because actual mainline Islam had a huge succession crisis. You know, that's where Shia and Sunni Islam comes from. And so the Nation of Islam went through this as well, where Elijah Muhammad had a son, Wallace Muhammad, who wanted to do kind of like the Mormons do, assimilationist thing. Like, let's drop the stranger parts of Nation of Islam theology, you know, about an evil scientist, Yaqub, inventing white people in a lab. Let's bring it more in line with Sunni Islam. And then on the other side, Louis Farrakhan, no biological descent from Elijah Muhammad or anything. He emerges kind of speaking to, no, let's stick to our radical roots. And he gets to determine the direction of the group after that. So I don't know. I think that the biological heir is always going to be bested by the more charismatic, unconnected person.
Yeah. I'm not very familiar with the Nation of Islam, but I do see them downtown sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I used to see them at that park that's right next to the Harold Washington Library, but it's been a minute. I wonder where they are now.
Yeah, no, they're an interesting group, definitely. I feel like as American as Mormons in that way. Like they come out of the mold of America.
Yeah.
And then, just the general life cycle of NRMs. We were talking about with Twin Flames. They're entering their commune period, the most troubling and scary period of a cult. But there's a lot of different ways that a cult can end. I think the more mundane one is like the ending with a whimper, I would say, where just they lose the sauce. Like
Shakers.
Yeah, I think that was
There's
more...
two left.
I was going to say Shakers, they didn't believe in breeding. So that's going to hurt you over time.
Yeah.
Versus Mormons saying you should be fruitful and
multiply. But their ending was such a whimper. There's two like 80 or 90-year-olds left.
Yeah, just sitting in a room talking about the good old days.
Yeah.
But with enthusiastic sobriety, like there wasn't some big crazy case that like caused a federal crackdown or anything. They just kind of like people who entered as young addicts and were now these like middle managers of counselors were just like this sucks. I'm living in a room with 4 other people in like a broken down motel. Like it seems like everyone else who isn't a part of this crazy world is doing all right for themselves, you know, driving cars, having a job. So if you can't deliver on the most baseline promises of like at least the like feeling of belonging and cult, like if you lose that, people are going to look at the material world and leave.
Yeah.
Or you can or you can just give them tons of material stuff. Like you can give them wealth by extracting it from other people, but it's just, I don't know, it's brushing up against the reality of there's like not enough to go around.
Yeah. And then ending with a bang, you know, the ending of cults can be very dramatic. I was just thinking with ES and Bob Mian, it's like, why does he not have a Wikipedia page? You know, why? Because there's that one really good article, but otherwise it's hard to find info on him. Yeah. But I think it's because there wasn't anything, again, dramatic to... Yeah. Like that's why we haven't heard about it.
A lot of people like experienced abuse, but not death. Like he kind of like kept in this sustainable evil middle.
Yeah. But yeah, I do think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the government should really leave NRMs alone. Unless they have like certifiable proof that the NRM is going to commit like terrorism on American soil. Otherwise, I think they need to leave them alone. Because again, it's only once there's like federal interference that like a lot of these mass casualties happen.
I think that the reason that the commune period is so dangerous is because it raises the specter of we don't know what they're doing in there.
Yeah.
And then the allegations can get raised. Because what caused like, so David Koresh and the Davidians living in the Waco compound in Texas, like there was allegations of child abuse. No way to confirm these because it's a lockdown compound. And then so that's what built up this whole like FBI ATF presence and this dialogue between negotiators and the compound, David Koresh. And this is the death spiral of NRMs, is where they are facing so much outside pressure that they look inward, and then that becomes just a pressure cooker, essentially. And it becomes this looming specter of we have no idea what's going on in there. They could have XYZ guns. And so I think that if a cult really wants to survive, like, well, A, don't stockpile weapons. But B, like your openness, like opening yourself to small raids would save you from a large standoff. But I know we don't have like prospective cult leaders like listening to this podcast looking for tips and stuff. I ended up on a YouTube hole yesterday. I watched a video of a guy like recommending the top tips for running your pizza business. I have no interest in running a pizza business or anything, but I'm like, how did I end up on this corner of here? And I'm kind of picturing the equivalent of that, but for cult leaders, where it's like, all right, cult leaders, I know the question you're all wondering, retention of members. How do you keep your retention up? Like,
I think it happens probably very rarely for people to intend to lead the path down to creating a cult. Like they usually start out like something random, like running a youth program or like, or with Twin Flames Universe, you know, like running a life coaching thing. That guy will say, someone found a tweet of his when he was on his like Hawaii trip before he came back and started everything. He was just like, I should start a cult. He tweeted this. So some of them, I would say, I don't know, maybe the first wave of 60s cult leaders came upon it. But I'm afraid that we have like people who are determined to be cult leaders. It's nice there's a smoking gun with Jeff. I mean, that will hold up whenever his inevitable federal trial comes out. Yeah.
It's so wild that that's happening like right now. Because at least with the Love Has Won people, like, I guess this is how we get into this. But I haven't seen this verbiage before, but one of the ways a cult can end, or one of the end stages of it, what I think is the rarest way for them to happen, is what I'm calling consumption of the leader. Yeah. Which is where the group gets so out of hand that rarely through malice, often through love, they end up like killing their leader. And so the clearest example of this is the Love Has Won people, where they're all grouped around Amy Carlson, feeding her more and more alcohol and colloidal silver, propping her up on live streams. She enters a period of like starvation. She gets down to like 85 pounds. And then eventually she starts to snap out of it and says like, no, take me to a real hospital. And all of her followers say like, well, the mother god would never want to be taken to a 3D hospital if she's trying to ascend to the 5D plane. We can't do that with her. And then so sorry for spoilers for the show, but she dies. And I think a similar thing kind of happened to Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He had, like, as he built this whole world around him of his advisor and his kind of inner circle, one of them was a very classic, you heard the term like Dr. Feelgood?
I've not.
Thing. So Dr. Feelgood is like a famous person will often attract a quack doctor around them that keeps them doped up. Elvis had this, Hitler had this, JFK kind of had this, Kanye, Kanye had this as well. I don't know why this type emerges independently so much, but yeah, apparently Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was on large amounts of nitrous, just like Kanye, and Valium as well. And he died at 58. But yeah, so I'm trying to think of what causes that end state. I think that maybe if you don't promise an apocalypse, your followers will create one. Like they will create
very
an
good theory.
Like, I don't know, but that's not really true because Amy Carlson from Love Is One was always like predicting some kind of end time thing, and then Rajneesh I think also said that the world was going to get nuked at some point too. So I don't know, maybe I'm shooting from the hip too much on that one.
But, I mean it happens regardless. Who knows why?
Yeah,
but yeah. And then on income methods, so these cults, like oftentimes they get their money from very wealthy members who have like large inheritances. Like when I was watching Wild Wild Country, there was a woman who said like she gave her father's entire inheritance to Bhagwan.
So I would use the gambling term and call those people whales, which is just like you have a lot of little fish that you bring in, but then you really got to land those whales. Like single people who are worth all the resources you put into them. Like I'm sure that in the Rajneeshis and stuff, like once they hear that someone has a trust fund, now they're assigned 3 sannyasins, which is what they're like adherents
or celebrities.
That kind of, they require more love and attention.
Yeah.
You get that doubly from them.
Yeah, I mean with Scientology, I learned from my dad last night that the celebrities, they don't have to wait to take the courses in Scientology. They get to take them faster. Whereas regular people, even if they have the money, they're not allowed to.
Oh, wow.
So it's not only just real capital, but also social capital can allow you to move up in the organization more quickly.
I like the thing they say in Scientology, which is that like if you skip a step of a lesson, if you like see the information before you're ready for it by doing prior lessons, you'll get pneumonia and die instantly. They said. So like if you've read stuff about like Xenu and all the zanier parts of Scientology, like you should have already died by pneumonia by now, basically, because you've been exposed to this information before your corporeal form was ready for it. Yeah, and then like on Baha'i, Phoebe Hearst was this like socialite back in the day who donated large amounts to Baha'i. She met the Baha'u'llah, and then later her like far down descendant Patty Hearst was actually kidnapped by a cult and brainwashed by them, which is the Symbionese Liberation Army. So like I think that these rich families that have like kind of directionless kids should really watch out. Like obviously rich kids are always at risk of just kind of burning out due to drugs or, being a fail son, all that kind of stuff. But I think you really need to keep them safe from new religious movements because they just have a big price tag over their head. And they feel like there's no way they're going to match up to their more successful, self-made ancestors. Yeah. So they're looking to maybe make inroads on the spiritual plane.
You know what also might be going on too is wealthy families, particularly in the Western world, they tend to be irreligious. And atheism and agnosticism are actually very difficult to pass down intergenerationally. Like you'll see with religious retention, some of the lowest religious retention rates are amongst atheists and agnostics, also Jehovah's Witnesses and some of the wackier, like newer Christian sects. But that could be it too. It's like, because there continues to be, the family doesn't have a religion that can be passed down intergenerationally. It's not established within the family. So then each successive generation could keep like flip-flopping.
Interesting.
I'm speculating.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. You had said to me that one of the characteristics of NRMs is that most of the members are converts.
Oh yeah, that's another thing is
which that doesn't work for Mormons because they still have a plurality of born Mormons, even though they do recruit heavily.
Well, that's an idea that people in new religious studies espouse, is that Professor Eileen Barker, for example, she says that like every religion at some point in its early existence was a new religious movement, which she thinks the term is most accurate in describing a religion in which the majority of present day practitioners are converts. So over 50%. That's what she thinks a new religion is. But yeah, every religion at some point was that.
Yeah, there's always the zeal of the convert. They're always like, they always have a little more to prove than someone born into it. I find that they often like enforce the rules and mores of religion more so as well.
Yeah. And that's a really nice generalization too, because it's one of the few ones that I came across that like people in that field will just say. Academics, they don't like generalizations, but that one they can't avoid it. They're like, yeah, that's true.
A lot of converts, yeah. But yeah, other ways that cults can keep themselves afloat is operating like actual legitimate businesses. I think this is always kind of strange because it requires them like dealing with the outside world, like through just, economics. But yeah, there's this place called the Yellow Deli that's run by the 12 Tribes New Religious Movement.
Yeah.
That is too boring to mention, I would say. Like, they're just the most bog standard. As I read through it, I'm like, there's nothing here that stands out. Like, oh, you were founded in the 60s. Oh, it's a little bit Jewish, a little bit Christian. Oh, and you make everyone dress the same, and structured marriage is just like dink, 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 like hitting all the complete boring. Like, come on, give me something to work with. A funny hat.
Yeah, I learned about it through like a YouTube video, and it wasn't a YouTuber I typically watch. It was, closer to the soy face genre.
Ah, yes, understood.
But it seems like a lot of them go to there just to make a video and make it sound like more interesting than it is. Mm-hmm. But yeah.
And then you brought up Dr. Bronner's soap.
I didn't actually mean to bring up that one because it wasn't Dr. Bronner's, but I did work at a grocery store for a little bit in college, and someone had mentioned to me that like a nice natural shampoo that's in the shampoo section was created by a cult. They're having some sort of labor problems. I don't remember the brand, but it wasn't Dr. Bronner's, but we can talk about them.
Dr. Bronner was a Jewish soap maker who came from Europe right before World War II. His whole family was killed in the Holocaust. And he started espousing a cult of one, I would say, a unique theology. And he would espouse this by putting it on his soap containers. And I didn't know he had a Chicago connection, which is that some open-minded students invited him to speak at U Chicago about his his religious beliefs. And then something happened and he wouldn't leave the dean's office. So they not only kicked him out, but they sent him to Elgin Psychiatric Hospital, which is this horrifying psychiatric hospital in Chicago that operated much longer than it should have. Like, it's the like bedlam in your mind, like the most horrifying loony bin type place. But they sent him there. He escaped from a mental asylum. Yeah. And then he went to California to start selling soap. But yeah, and so like they kept his packaging the same, but it has just the most like schizo posting like, kind of stuff on it, and it's like weirdly Jewish and Christian.
Yeah,
he never started anything though, like a cult.
Yeah, I mean, I always see their soap. I've never really gotten into their products, but on the Yellow Deli, that idea of having like a restaurant to support the New Religious Movement. Mm-hmm. I actually have a brother and actually a sister that worked at a restaurant that was like that. It was called Victory's Banner.
In Chicago?
Yes. It was a vegetarian breakfast spot in North Center. Mm-hmm. It shut down. It got rebranded under new ownership. They didn't want to get associated with the name anymore because Victory's Banner was run by followers of Sri Chinmoy, who is like an Indian spiritual leader and guru who brought meditation to the United States in the 1960s. He's one of the first people to do so. Wow. And my brother working there was not a follower of Sri Chinmoy, and my sister wasn't either. They were the only outsiders allowed to work there, but they had to follow a lot of rules while they were there. Like, my brother had to wear all white. My sister had to wear a sari. But the restaurant, like, even if you didn't know who this guy was, you'd be like, why is there a picture of him on the wall? Why is he on the back of the menu?
So bizarre.
But it was open for over a decade. Like the crunchy liberal people in North Center, which North Center is one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Chicago, but they loved it.
It's so bizarre. You just don't picture in a city like this. But I guess that's the size of Chicago and maybe our cheap real estate as well.
Yeah.
Is that like anyone can have a spot here. Like,
I mean, I feel like the older the NRM is, the more likely things have been grandfathered in that a new NRM could never have pulled off. Like, for example, the I Am Temple downtown.
Yeah, the I Am movement was like a new religious movement out of like 1920s and 30s or so. Just very bog standard new Christianity stuff with some like early New Age things, pre-1960s New Age feats. But they bought an old Elks Lodge in the Loop. So
so they didn't build that.
They didn't build it. Okay. No, but so the Elks Lodge was built in like the 1910s or so, and then Great Depression hit. Elks Lodge, I guess, cratered enough for a small upstart NRM to purchase the building, and they still have it. It's a beautiful building. It's in downtown Chicago. Come to think of it, it's not far from the new Scientology Center either. I wonder if they feel like they're in competition for the lost souls of Chicago.
Yeah, it's not that easy to find info on the IM movement.
Yeah.
But yeah, it speaks to how big the city is, but also how prevalent NRMs are, that like I hadn't actually heard of that before this week. And I'm sure I've walked by that building at some point, but I never noticed it.
No, there's a lot of them just hanging out. So I haven't known anyone who's fallen too much into a cult. I knew a guy who did too much acid and became a Gregorian monk. That could count, maybe. But a lot of people on the Jewish side of my family, this is my like pretty far extended family, are what you'd call Baal Teshuvim, which is people who were secular Jews, and then they have returned to the fold in terms of they've like embraced the parts of Orthodox Judaism to varying degrees. And so they become much more observant. They keep the Sabbath. They keep kosher. I don't know. I wouldn't say that's a new religious movement, even though like the Baal Teshuvah, it's been called a movement, but it's like...
isn't Baal like a demon?
It is, but I'm trying to... It's just a name, though.
Okay.
Let me make sure.
I think people in the 1990s would freak out if they heard that, though.
Yeah.
During the Satanic Panic.
Yeah, exactly. I was just watching True Detective season 1, so I'm thinking about a lot of Satanic Panic stuff. But yeah, it's interesting because they don't all just like a whole bunch of Baal Teshuvim don't just meet up together. Like they just go to their closest Orthodox congregation and then just kind of get caught up into the classic like style of Judaism. And so I don't know, maybe I think it's coming from the same impulses. These are the people in my family who have become more observant. Like they're not early 20s lost souls by any means. They are like professionals at the top of their fields, who I think saw that life lacking in spiritual depth and character. I think it also comes out of a fear of losing heritage as a Jew as well. Like because assimilation is so like real. And I mean, as I've experienced, I'm pretty assimilated.
Yeah. And then on a final note, we'll talk about our own religious beliefs. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So, for me, it's like thinking about this week, I realized that I've realized this before, but my own belief in Catholicism, my belief in God, it is predicated on things that are outside of Catholicism, mostly a belief in ghosts and of premonitions. I do shy away from things like tarot cards, astrology. I don't believe they're real. I think because they're more material, the sort of physical mediums I can recognize like, oh yeah, it doesn't really make sense that I'm a Libra because those stars happen to look like a scale. Like that doesn't really make sense to me. But I have like family members who've had a lot of spiritual encounters, premonitions. I'll hear stories. I've also been in situations where like, say I go over to see my family, my brother suddenly is like, oh, I dreamed about what's going to happen next. And then it does actually happen. And like there are some pretty wild stories. I won't go into them because I can't do them justice. But one is actually that my grandfather, he once had an extremely vivid dream, and he would associate animals and different things with numbers, and he realized it was telling him to go bet on a horse race in a certain way. And he actually went and he bet $16,000, or he won $16,000, which was $170,000 in today's dollars.
Crazy.
But yeah, things like that. So I grew up in a household where like I fully believed everything my family was saying. I still do. And I think that like my faith isn't, well, yes, I believe in it, but I think my faith is different than the pure faith that's expected of Christians who don't believe in this stuff. It's actually harder for them. But yeah, I can see how for myself, I pull outside of my own religion in order to support my ideas. And that's what people are doing with NRMs as well.
Yeah, and what's like the mainline Catholic stance on that kind of stuff?
There are no ghosts in the Bible. They don't exist. But you can, saints are real. They do reveal visions to people. I think if you interpret those experiences through the lens of Catholicism, you're like, oh, that was a demon, or that was a vision from God, a vision from a saint. There's a way to talk about it where it becomes more acceptable. Like, for example, Joan of Arc. Or no, sorry, I meant to say St. Catherine of Siena. Like, if you read about her, I can see how you might think like, oh, she was schizophrenic or had something going on. But to interpret it in the appropriate way, which I actually think, for all I know, it was real. She is a saint. I do recognize her as a saint. But yeah, I think there's a way to interpret experiences with spiritual beings, and it becomes acceptable through a Catholic lens.
Yeah, it's just so, I don't know. I always said I want to believe in that kind of stuff. I personally haven't experienced too much of the paranormal, But I think it's something that I really respect about you, which is that you really like value other people's like lived experiences, and like you value anecdotes a lot. I think, not that I'm some kind of like destroyed by facts and logic type guy, but I think I'm a lot more, this can sound dismissive, but I think that people can be wrong about what they experience. I think that's like a big difference in some people's like thinking style, because I think that people say like, oh, you can't invalidate someone else's experience, and I think that I've totally misremembered things, and I've totally like recalled things incorrectly, or just missed out on a sphere of interpretation is what I'd say. That's a very weird new age way to put it, but like a different lens of interpretation of things. Like, I don't know. I guess that's why I can always couch things in doubt and not really like go for that style of stuff. I don't know, kind of tying back to NRMs and stuff. Like I've never really believed that I'm that special. And so I've always had, I'm like, of course I'm not going to see a ghost. Of course I'm not going to have a personal revelation. And that's something that as I watch all this like cult content and stuff, that I can never fully like connect with the people who talk about getting sucked up into cults, is that they always kind of say like, I was directionless, but I always knew I was destined for something greater. I've never felt like that. Like I always just grateful to be here. Hey, happy to be here. Happy to participate. Like whatever I get in life, I'm like just good with. I just didn't think that I was like, I've never felt like I'm Luke Skywalker waiting to get, discovered.
Waiting to get saved.
Yeah. No, I never felt like I was waiting to get saved. I always feel like I have to like move things forward in my own life. I don't think I'm going to be a part of some grand mission. I think I just need to like keep working ahead. But I'm kind of jealous of that optimism, I'd say.
Yeah. I mean, for myself, I'm not someone who's ever had a spiritual experience. I feel like I have something watching out for me. I felt that in so many ways across my life. But even though, I've never actually like had the experiences my family members have had, being around them when they've happened does really make me think they're real. Like one time at a family reunion of sorts, we were at this farm of very distant relative owns. There's a lake there. We were at this family reunion. My sister was sitting across from me, saw a woman behind me. Wasn't anyone we knew. And then we were like, where did she go? And then we went over there. There were spider webs everywhere where she was standing. And we were like, it's like, I didn't even see this woman, but I was like, okay, like there's enough there that I can start to believe it. Yeah. But I'm like you though, where I think I'm never going to truly experience it. Like, I could have a very vivid dream. I could have a visitation, but I don't see that happening to me. But that's okay. I think there's enough here in the physical world for me to believe.
I like meaningful coincidences. Yeah. That's as close as I'll get. I like just very like, what are the odds of that? And it's very, very small. And it's like, oh, so it's meaningful. That's as close as I'll dip my toe in, I'll say. Yeah. And then my more religious upbringing, I think I've like signaled to it in the past that I'm not especially religious. I wouldn't say I'm an atheist, but I don't have a strong belief in God. I wouldn't say. Very common among Jewish people. People are always confused by that. You can even put that on dating apps. You can put like atheist/Jewish.
Culturally Jewish.
Yeah.
Culturally Jewish. Which is a lot more popular to say than culturally Catholic.
yes.
Yeah.
But I think it's just the choice between being more observant is different in Judaism than other religions, because observant Catholicism is not like observant Judaism, like in terms of the strictures you have to hold yourself to. I think my approach has always been like maximizing my human experience. And I know that if I reach the levels of observancy that people in my family have, like there's a lot of stuff in my life that like I couldn't do that I've already done, and I'd be closing the door on other stuff. Yeah. So the eating pork thing, I always kick myself for that. I'm just like, could I actually give it up? And I like try and visualize all the wonderful pork-based experiences I've had in my life, because I have so many Polish and Filipino friends. And I'm just like, no, I can't give it up. And that's the easiest one. That is the easiest one you could give up. I think the hardest thing is when you become more observant in Judaism, the idea is to kind of cleave yourself off from non-Jews in a way. Like, not on purpose, but it happens if you can't do anything from sundown Friday to sunset Saturday.
Yeah.
Like, I wouldn't be able to be in my fraternity, basically. There's so many different things that would happen in that period. Definitely wouldn't be able to do rugby. Games are always on Saturdays. Yeah, there's just so much like that. It feels pretty core to like my lived experience. I'd have to get like not do. I think I mentioned this on the pod before somehow, but was involved in a Jewish organization in college, and there was with an Orthodox Jewish girl. And I was telling, like, we were asking each other how our summers were. And as I was explaining all the road trips and summer camp and like all the stuff I had done, I just kind of like realized I should stop because I was describing things she could never do.
Yeah.
Because like she can't be a lifeguard. She can't even wear a swimsuit, I don't think. But yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me with Catholicism, I feel like if I were to become more devout, it actually would help me connect to more people. Mm-hmm. Like I actually might get confirmed. I think I will. I just found out my schedule probably like will work out for this, but I want to get confirmed starting. I needed to do classes starting in March. But, you know, for example, I told my boss that, who I know is like a devout Catholic, and I could just see her like light up. Yeah. Uh-huh. And I don't know. I feel like it's a way to connect to people. I feel like in that way it opens up more doors.
I think that I definitely see the depths of like joy and experience that my more observant family has. Like when they're all together reciting prayers in sync, and I don't know all the words. I understand that, but I think I've kind of, in a way, chosen breadth over depth, and I don't do that a lot in my life. I think I like to be very focused and get very good at one thing. I don't like to spread myself. I don't know. I'm also a hypocrite. I like to be a jack of all trades, but I also want to get good at things. And so I understand that, like, if I spent more time being Jewish, I'd spend less time doing everything else. And so I don't know. I have to deal with that a lot in life. But I feel like I'm also continuing a long tradition in my family of not being that Jewish either. We've just kind of sustained like a just enough kind of thing. You'd have to go back to my great grandparents to get any kind of like kosher kind of lifestyle stuff. Like, so that's why it is so interesting that this stuff popped up in the 90s for my family. Everyone's keeping Shabbos and being kosher.
Yeah. Well, this was a really good episode. I feel like it's probably going to be one of our best ones. Like,
I'm always cautious to say, but yeah, I had a lot of fun doing it.
I mean, this was a somewhat boring topic that came together really, really well. And it feels like studying for a test sometimes, like how much I have to cram. And we put this together in like 4 days because we just recorded the last one like 4 days ago. Yeah. So, wow.
Oh, yeah. And to anyone in the Discord, like if you have any experiences with NRMs, please let us know. I am always morbidly curious.
We're going to judge you in the good way if you're part of one. No, we're going to judge you to be cool.
As I've said, I'm kind of jealous of like the fun times they seem to have before everything goes bad.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. Have a good week, everyone, and Merry Christmas. And then also...
Happy Hanukkah.
Yeah. Bye, everyone.